Good morning, everyone. Here we are at day 3 of the Special Libraries Conference 2019 in Cleveland. We just finished a very informative session entitled Best Practices for Cannabis Law, Keeping Up with Cannabis Regulation. I have with me the presenters here. We have Jacob Weaver from Wagner, from the
Cleveland School of Cannabis.
Cleveland School of Cannabis. Sue Mecklem from Davis Wright Tremaine, and Bobby Weaver from
California Western School of Law.
California Western School of Law. And so what we want, I just want to take a minute or two just to talk about some things that have become real prevalent in the cannabis legalization and arena. And the first is about economic equity. I know in Illinois we passed a law, and one of the reasons why we were able to get that law passed was because there was promises, who knows if they're going to come to fruition, but promises of economic equity where African Americans, Asian Americans, Latino, or Latinx people can get into the various components of the cannabis business. From your experience looking at the laws in, say, Oregon and California, have you seen sort of a groundswell that is being propelled and helping move the legalization process forward?
I wouldn't say I've seen a groundswell, but there is talk about it. I was at a Portland community event, and there were some African Americans talking about how this would be beneficial to their community.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure at this point how beneficial.
Okay.
I don't know the end result yet.
Bobby, what are you hearing in California?
Well, I mean, I don't know any statistics or anything like that, but from what I read, the municipalities that are allowing the sale and distribution of marijuana products are usually the more urban.
Okay.
And so it's likely that there would be some more opportunities for people of color.
Okay.
In Ohio here, we actually, when we passed medical cannabis through the legislature in 2016, we did include a clause that said certain percentage of the licenses that were awarded had to go to economic or disadvantaged communities of color.
Okay.
So that has been challenged. I don't remember exactly what the status is on that case, if it's even still pending. It's my understanding that that sort of clause, in my professional opinion, is likely unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
However, I still think it's a worthwhile goal, and I think that it is something that you're seeing talked about more in states that are on the brink of legalizing, and the states that are coming next.
The next thing I want to talk about is really more of a cultural issue. As we talked about during the presentation, there's not necessarily conflict, but there are different perspectives between like DEA and FDA. DEA is, let's face it, a law enforcement type of organization, so they have a certain perspective. FDA has sort of a more science-based sort of perspective on these things. And I'm curious to get your opinions on the fact that, do we need to really see a culture change in the U.S. about cannabis? I mean, oftentimes in many areas, people talk about cannabis or marijuana, and they immediately think of, oh, it's going to become like Haight-Ashbury and my neighborhood, and we're all going to be like Cheech and Chong and sitting on the stoop smoking a blunt. What do you see as some of the cultural changes that have to happen in society so that the laws can sort of follow along with that? Do you see that as an issue as well?
Well, I think, for example, here in Ohio and again, in states that are sort of on the cusp of legalizing, particularly in the medical field, they're really moving as far away from that whole image as possible. In Ohio, they don't even call them bud tenders at the dispensary, they call them patient care specialists. And it's very much treated like a medical facility, in terms of sterileness, in terms of, regulation. It's actually, the dispensaries are governed by the Ohio Board of Pharmacy, so they're treating it very much like a pharmacy.
Okay, that's good.
In fact, many of these companies are hiring pharmacists to manage those dispensaries. So I think you are seeing that shift already, and I think that it's just only going to continue to become more and more of a thing as we move forward. And continue to move away from that sort of hippie stereotype. Not that there's anything wrong with that either, But for folks, particularly in more conservative areas, conservative states, like here in Ohio, in the rural areas in particular, we have older folks who are more conservative. They kind of need to see that it's being taken seriously, and it's not going to be just some sort of, loosey-goosey, situation like California started out as, where there were basically no regulations and it was the Wild West.
Lastly, now we know that sort of Colorado was in the vanguard of this movement to really bring state legalization to the world of cannabis. The question is, what states are other states looking toward? States that don't have a legalization program, are they looking to California? Are they looking to Ohio? Are they looking to Colorado? Where is sort of everyone sort of tending to look at?
I would tend to think they look mainly at California,
Right,
but
yeah.
also take a view of all of them.
Okay.
Right,
To
I mean,
get bits and pieces from
we've
all of them.
had legalized for medicinal purposes for a long time, but we became for recreational purposes just in 2016, and when it was voted by the voters in the November 2016 election. So the regulation is new. As I mentioned, it's being challenged by some municipalities because there's different viewpoints. In some place like San Diego that's more progressive, there's not as much in terms of a challenge to the regulations. But when you go into some of the central California, more rural areas, it's more conservative, and so they are challenging.
I think, just to echo those points, I mean, you do look at everything. You look to see what's working, what's not, no matter where it is. When I wrote the law that I was trying to pass back in 2016, I think Oregon actually was probably one of my main sources of inspiration, believe it or not. I really liked that law. I know Anthony Johnson, who was one of the main architects of that law as well. He was the chief petitioner, actually, I believe. So he actually consulted on our law in terms of what we were doing with our tax section. I think Colorado certainly has a lot of great value as well, just seeing how they've been so adaptive and responsive to changes, and when they realize something's not working or could be working better, they go in and change it right away. Some of these other states, California, Ohio being a couple of them, really just are not responsive at all. And so I think that's really ultimately what it comes down to. You do have to take everything into account, but how responsive are you? Oregon, another state, very responsive, and they have some great laws up there.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that California has looked at Colorado and Washington State and Oregon to see how their dispensary system was set up. I mean, I don't know if anybody's truly organized.
You make a point about it. You're not sure who's truly organized or if anybody is. Do you see a day where we'll have sort of like a uniform cannabis law, like we have the Uniform Commercial Code, or you? I mean, I don't mean tomorrow or the next day, but I mean eventually.
Yeah, I think it depends upon how quickly the federal government works.
Yeah.
And I mean, we had problems with the DEA raids and some of the medical marijuana dispensaries in California during the Bush administration. Obama was kind of more laissez-faire about the dispensaries and states that had legalized marijuana. We don't really know with the Trump administration how they're heading.
Well, Sessions was, when Sessions was AG,
Sessions
it was a little
yeah.
worrisome. Barr has sort of backed off on that and basically reinstated the Cole memo, so, what was the original question again?
It was about, do you ever see a day where we'll have sort of like a
Okay,
uniform
yeah.
cannabis law, like we have the Uniform Commercial Code?
I sure hope so, and I do think we probably will see that eventually. I know that there are organizations in the country that are working on those sorts of things right now, particularly just like in their segment of the industry. So there's, people that are in the processing side that are working on, standard regulations and best practices in that regard. I think we will eventually see something like that. In fact, I would love to be involved in something like that. I've often thought about that myself.
And I think going back to where you were talking about minority ownership of the dispensaries and things like that, because it is still illegal under the federal government, there's some issues with bank financing.
Yeah.
So,
Right, that's
um,
a hurdle.
Well, not only bank financing, but like credit card
right,
processing. I mean,
credit card processing, they can't use, like, I know from people that have told me about dispensaries, most of the dispensaries in California are cash
Cash
only.
only.
So, so they don't have to deal with credit card companies and banks and things like that. So that would be an issue for minority ownership too. If you're not coming from a background where you have a lot of capital and you
Mhm.
have to look for financing, that's an issue, so.
Always an issue. The banking issue is getting better. I mean, there's still a lot of cash only. One of the aspects that's helping improve the banking issue is the fact that most of the people getting into the business are rich, older,
White
guys.
dudes.
And
Right.
they have capital and they have access to
Right.
banking and merchant services. And so they basically go to their banks and say, hey, I'm getting into this business. Give me some accounts or I'm going to take all of my businesses elsewhere. And so the banks kind of capitulate to that. And so there is a lot more banking. There are some community banks, credit unions, things like that. Here in Ohio, there's one down in Dayton that's pretty much serving all of the Ohio medical cannabis businesses. In fact, we even have an account there at the school. Don't even touch the planet. We lost our bank once and have had issues with merchant services and payroll. So even when you're not directly in the industry touching the plant, they're still sort of shy away. I think that'll change once we have rescheduling. That'll open it up a lot.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for an excellent program. I want to thank you for taking the time to spend with me, and hopefully we'll get this interview up on Twitter and Facebook and YouTube sometime today. Thank you very much.
Great.
Right.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.